a bit unusual for the Athenaeum. And also, it's an Athenaeum author, so we're always delighted to have one of our own speak to us. In the unlikely event that you just wandered in, I will tell you the slightest bit about the subject so that you can leave if you feel you must. This concerns a small book that was published in 1669 called Portuguese Letters. And as we said in our own blurb publishing this talk, the letters, quote, spoke of love in a manner so direct, so precise, and so raw that they sent shivers of recognition through the sophisticated strata of polite society. The letters have had a long life since 1669 and have appealed to the interests of painters and poets and other writers and scholars. And the debate has continued since then as to whether a nun really could have written such stuff. Myriam Cyr's book, Letters of a Portuguese Nun, Uncovering the Mystery Behind 17th Century Forbidden Love, addresses all these issues and more. Though this is Myriam Cyr's first book, she's had an active life as an actress, is well recognized for roles on the stage in the U.S. and England and Canada, I believe, as well, and has also appeared in quite a number of movies, 17 movies, including I Shot Andy Warhol. And she's been a member of the Athenaeum for a number of years. She'll answer any questions you may have and sign copies of her book, if you wish, at the end of her talk. So please welcome Myriam Cyr.
Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for being here. And thank you very much to the Athenaeum and to Monica Higgins, who is the event coordinator. And I have to say that the Athenaeum was instrumental in a lot of my research, of which a document that I will refer to later on in the talk that was published by an American scholar in 1926. And also the Athenaeum has in its possession, and I highly recommend that you seek it out, they have a very, very old edition of the original letters, of the letters themselves, in their rare books room, and you can make an appointment to come and see them, and it's quite a lovely thing to behold. And they have also a more recent but still ancient edition of the letters, which I consulted and kept for a very long time, in fact, too long a time, and so I now owe $5 to the Athenaeum. And but I think they know my address, so they'll be able to find me. This is a subject very close to my heart, and I'm always amazed after all these years spent researching it and, in fact, performing the letters. I was lucky enough to first perform them in England, in London, and then subsequently in New York, to feel as passionate about them today as I did when I first encountered them. And it's interesting to me that when I first saw them performed in Canada, in Montreal, and when I saw them, they came to me as a revelation, as a shock. They were as modern to me as I'm sure they would have been in 1669. I think one of the great beauties of these letters is that they are and remain as important today, emotionally shocking, in a good way, in ways that make us recognize and help empower us when we go through the pain of separation, and also understand who we are as humans when we go through love. And it was very interesting to me because this weekend, my husband and I were invited to lunch with a young journalist for the AP, a 30-year-old journalist. And at this lunch, he had invited his grandmother, who is this American high society, wonderful, wonderful battle axe, who had seen the book on the counter the day before and picked it up and had said to her grandson, "I know these letters." And her grandson had said, "Oh, Grandma, that's impossible. They've just been published. This is a brand new book." And she said, "Sonny, "These letters are older and more famous than you and I will ever be." And of course she was right. And of course she did know of them. And it was lovely because when she met me, she had been obviously reading the book that previous day and over the night, or I don't know, she'd read very fast, and she said to me, "My young lady," she said, "I must tell you, I always knew these letters were written by a woman. I just hadn't figured out how he had entered the convent. Thank you for telling me." And so, it was very exciting. And it is true that these letters are very, very famous in Europe, but they are not here, and there are good reasons for that, which is that they've been the victim of a controversy. No, so let me back up now, because there are two stories in this book. There's the story, this heart-wrenching, wonderful, true, deeply touching story between this young nun and a French officer. And then there is the story of the letters she wrote to him, and the letters which got published, unbeknownst to her, and were to take the salons of Paris by storm, and literally upset the balance of power between men and women at that time. And the journey of the letters themselves is as fascinating a tale as is the tale of the nun and the French officer. It's interesting that today the nun and the French officer, they are documented historical figures. We all know they exist. Everyone recognizes that an affair took place between them, yet the authenticity of the letters themselves is still up for debate. And I personally find that rather extraordinary, but I'll try and walk you through ever so briefly the story. It's like I'm reminded of my mother was raised in a convent by these nuns, these wonderful nuns, wonderful erudite nuns, and she was in charge of selling the student newspaper. So she would come up to all these young students and say, "Oh, you must buy my paper. In it you have this, this, and this, and this, and this." And they would say at the end, "Well, we don't have to buy it anymore. You've told us everything that's in it. So I have to be very careful." Mariana Alcoforado, that was her name, was a young girl born in 1640 on the eve of Portugal's revolution for independence. Portugal, very few of us know this, but Portugal was a country which at its height ruled an empire as great as the Roman Empire. It was a seafaring nation, and they were the first to trade in Japan. They owned big chunks of India. They, as we know, had Brazil under their tutelage. And they were extremely powerful. But 60 years before Mariana Alcoforado was to be born, they had come under difficult times and had been taken under Spain. And Spain now ruled Portugal. And by the time Mariana was born, the Portuguese and Portugal itself was a shadow of its former self. And a few months following her birth, Portuguese men and women would rise against Spain and take over the country, their country, and would enter a war that would last 28 years. And this war would be the backdrop against which Mariana Alcoforado would be raised. So by the age of 10, she was sent to the convent to enter a cloistered life, never to exit the convent again, as long as she would live. And there she would be educated, raised, do her first vows, become a nun, and eventually become a very powerful woman in the convent. I think we today balk at her having been forced literally to enter convent life at the age of 10. But there are two main reasons for that at the time. Firstly, she was a second born, and families not wanting to sever or fragment estates would marry off their eldest daughter, give in inheritance the whole of the property to the eldest son, and the rest, the other daughters that would subsequently be born, would all enter religious life, and the other sons would enter the military or, again, religious orders. So for Mariana, this was not a surprising decision or a choice, and one she would have accepted as a matter of fate when she entered the convent of Conceição. Conceição was situated in a city called Beja. And Beja was in the southernmost part of Portugal, in a desolate and isolated city surrounded by immense plains, but was a bishopric, and so had a huge religious. It was a huge religious enclave. There were 7 convents in her little town alone, and at the time there were only 4,000 people living in Beja, which was quite a populated town for the time. So when Mariana entered, she was raised to be versed in politics, in writing, in languages, in the arts, and she was also raised to be able to entertain, to serve tea, to play a musical instrument. Certainly she would have performed in plays, and in effect, these nuns were being raised as Western equivalents of geishas. And there was a good reason for that, which is that convents had to supply a great number of mouths to feed. They had huge financial responsibilities. Her convent alone had something like 800 employees. These women employed judges, prosecutors, bloodletters, which is doctors that would let blood. They had someone in charge specifically for that, because at the time it was considered a curative form of medicine. And they would have candle makers, they had dairy farms, they had orchards, they had agricultural farms. So this was a big microcosm of society, if you will. And so they had huge financial burdens. So it was extremely important for them to attract rich benefactors and patrons. And so for that, nuns had to be able to entertain. And indeed, they were so good at it that a law was passed in, I believe it's 1663 or 64, saying that too many men were falling in love with nuns and that had to stop. And there was a special term that was coined called, the men were called fritiricos, which means nun lovers. And these men would come to the convents for solace, to be re-energized, to have mundane conversation, and to be entertained. And it's interesting that meanwhile they left their wives at home, locked under bolt and key, with barred windows. They kept women illiterate on purpose. And I've always wondered how they never connected the dots of, gee, I'm, attracted to this erudite woman who knows how to speak several languages, but I don't want my wife to know how to read, and perhaps I could find her interesting. So it was a strange time, obviously, in Portuguese society. So Mariana was raised to be all those things. As she grew up, the war continued, and Portugal's coffers were emptied. And so the Queen Regent at the time brokered a deal with Louis XIV, who had signed a peace treaty with Spain stipulating that he would not get involved in the Portuguese wars, but secretly agreed with the Queen of Portugal that he would send his best men, his best marksmen, his best shooters. And it's a great story because all these young noblemen who were desperate to fight in wars readily signed up to fight in the Portuguese wars, but to do that they had to give up their titles, not as nobility, but their title in the French army. They had to resign from the French army. And so they were all stacked in boats, in the galleys of the boats. And these boats were supposedly merchant boats en route to Ireland or England, and they would be intercepted by pirates, when these pirates were in fact secret agents at the employ of the King of Portugal, and these pirates would kidnap these poor soldiers and bring them to Portuguese soil. So by the time Mariana met the person she would fall in love with, his name was Noël Bouton, Count of Chamilly. He had been in Portugal for 4 years, and by then was a huge war hero. It was, I don't know, I always akin them as the equivalent of rock stars. It's like Mick Jagger has arrived into town. It really was as big as that. And so all the different convents were vying for the presence of the soldiers. And there's a theory that exists that Mariana's brother, younger brother, who was the legitimate heir to the Alcoforado fortune, was the one who introduced her to him. Now, I will skip the details, only to let you know that they did fall in love. They did have an affair that would transform them both. And neither of them would ever fully recover from it. And he left. He was forced through political machinations. He was forced to return to France. And she wrote him 5 letters that to this day are unparalleled documents on chartering unrequited love. And they are deeply, deeply moving and deeply touching. The letters then went on a journey of their own. This young man, I have one of those too. This young man, this young captain would eventually go on to become the most famous general of France. And it's interesting that we don't know of him today. 2 reasons for that. One, because he's always been labeled as the cad in the affair, the one who had abandoned her and had done nothing about it. And also because it so happens that he was so popular and so famous, he was a threat to Louis XIV's Minister of War, who was called Louvois. So Louvois made absolutely sure that this man's career would be hindered, and he would never get the proper recognition he deserved. He, very quickly after having returned to France, would leave France to go fight another war, leaving the letters behind in the hands of a young man who was his friend, who passed them on to his mother, who was called the Duchesse de Longueville, the Duchess of Longueville. And she happened to be the best friend of a marquise called the Marquise de Sablé. Now, these women were extremely powerful women. They had, in their lifetimes, created what are called salons, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And these salons are, in fact, what we now know as hair salons, where women come and talk, are, in fact, the result of these salons. And in these salons, women held court, and they held all power, which was an extraordinary thing in those days, because, as we know, women had a secondary role in politics and matters of faith, and so they had created these venues for themselves, where men were obliged to follow their rules. And what is fascinating is when you go back and examine these women's lives, is understanding what had prompted them to create these salons. And many of them came from arranged marriages, had been betrayed by men left, right, and center, had been abandoned, and so it was their way of dealing with all the hurt and the pain they had received in their lives, was to create a forum in which men suddenly had to obey their rules, and they were very, very precise etiquette. And in fact, from these salons come a lot of what we consider good manners today in society. And the Marquise de Sable is really known as the first hostess. And much of what she did and how she did things stays with us today. And even Martha Stewart takes a few pages out of her book. So in those days, privacy had a very different connotation than we have today, and private letters were often circulated amongst people as a form of entertainment, as a form of information, and it was considered fair game. So I explain in the book how it came to be that these letters were eventually came to circulate in the salons of the Marquise de Sable, but all this to say that they took Paris by storm, literally. And it's funny because I remember my editor, when I had written that, said to me, "You know, that's a little bit of a cliche. Are you sure you really want that in there?" And I said, "I know, but it really happened that way." I said, "It's a cliche for a good reason." And they fell into the hands of a publisher who published them. And at the time in Paris, there were 10,000 literate people out of 400,000 people who lived in Paris at that time. By the time Chamille had passed away, her lover, and he lived another 40 years, there were 50,000 copies of the letters in circulation. So this is to say how important and what an impact they had on society then. And within 2 years of the letters being published, it would be said, if you were referring to a passion, "Oh, you must be having a Portuguese." And so they really had become part and parcel of French society. And what they did, which was very important, is they created a forum and an arena in which suddenly women were able to express their end of the equation, their end of how they felt, and it gave them words, it articulated. And because it came from a foreign country, they were able to embrace that even more. And it's very interesting, and this is where the letters take on the life of their own, is that within months of these letters being published, there was a review of the book at a time when reviewers didn't exist. There was no such thing as a critic at that time. That would arrive later in history. And the letters were criticized. And I'm just going to read you the quote because I think it's so interesting. And this is, as I say, months after the letters were published. "Would you like to judge a book by its title? It seems to me that there are excellent books that are rotting in the shops, while others who are worth nothing sell out. Look no further than the Portuguese Letters. Isn't it surprising how many copies have sold? And I see no other reason than, if not the charm of novelty, that it was pleasant to read the letters of a nun, however they were written, without considering the title is a game of a deceitful publisher." And he goes on to say, "Well, there is some tenderness in these letters, if you consider the oohs and the ahs. But if by that you mean feelings, you will be hard-pressed to find two remarkable ones. And in truth, it is not a great misery that we should read a book that says so little." 50 years later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, was still annoyed at the success of the letters. And he said, "Women in general do not like art, are versed in none, have no genius for them. They can have success with small works that demand only lightness of spirit, taste, and grace. But that celestial fire that warms and brazens the soul, that genius that consumes and devours, that burning eloquence, those sublime emotions that carry their marvels to the bottom of our hearts, leaves always to be desired in women's writings. They cannot describe or feel love. I would bet everything in the world that the Portuguese letters were written by a man. And so, there would be scholars through the years that would try and prove this true. The nun was unknown for 150 years after the letters were published, and her name was finally revealed by a Franciscan monk. She was a Franciscan, so of the same order as Mariana, and he said that he found her name written in the cover of one of the letters, the original publication of the letters. And so Portuguese historians set out on a quest and discovered that indeed the letters were published, that the nun existed. I'm sorry, I think I just saw my cousin. The nun existed, of course, that Chamilly existed, everyone knew that. And so therefore, everybody thought, well, this is it. We know she existed. We know he was at this town at this time, in this town at that time. Therefore, there's no question that these letters are authentic. But in 1926, an American scholar called Frederick C. Green, whose papers I found thanks to the Athenaeum, published a paper saying that the letters, in his opinion, were fakes. And the reason why is that he had found the privilege, in other words, the option granting the right to publish the letters. And this option said, this day, the 17th of November, 1668, has been presented to us a king's privilege given in Paris, the 28th of October, for a book titled The Valentines, Portuguese Letters, Epigrams and Madrigals by Guirac. And he said, aha, you see, here is the proof that these letters are written by a man. It says here, black on white, all these things have been written by a man called Guirac. And in 1962, two French scholars decided to prove this to be true and set off on a journey, as it were, to establish who this man Guirac was. And he was a French aristocrat who was a mundane man. He was called an honest man, and an honest man in those days meant someone who abided by respectfully to all the different rules of etiquette. He was at the time unemployed, desperately looking for money. He loved to eat, so he was always indebting himself with good wine and good food. And he indeed got hold of these letters and had written a book himself called Valentines, which was a game called the Game of Valentines, in which 30 men and 30 women got together and picked out little poems from a bag and would read them to each other, and from that would create hilarious juxtapositions and situations. And it is from these little poems that we today have Valentine's Day cards. And so it is my belief that he bartered, and it was imperative for him to get published, to be published, because if he was published, this would help him secure a job, and he desperately needed a job. And so he bartered his book against the letters to be published. But the researchers, the scholars in Paris, never drew that conclusion. They drew the conclusion that, and I explain why in the book, that Guirac must have been the author of these letters because, first of all, a nun lost in the middle of nowhere could never have written these letters on love. And the book I have written, as it were, explains how this nun, this erudite nun, whose job was to be a scribe and therefore to write, could very well have written these letters and would have written them directly in French to her lover. And one of the, I think, very important pieces of information that I was able to uncover is that at the time, to sign anthologies were very, very popular. And so it would often happen that one person would take responsibility in a privilege, asking for an option of several works from different authors, but it would go under the cover of one single writer. And so it's very feasible that they didn't know the name of the nun, and in order to get the letters published, by law they needed to name someone's name needed to be attached to them, that they would have been inserted in an anthology and signed, and Guirac would have taken responsibility for them. And I think that's a seminal piece of information that has never been brought to light, as it were, in connection to these letters. And I can see that I've been talking way too long. So I would say that for me, what is most important even today for me, or what moves me the most, is today the passion that still rings true in these letters today. And I think that in our time, I always feel we live in a rather tepid time, where people are fearful of standing up for what they believe, or for what they believe is right, or protest against what they believe is wrong. And I'm always reminded of there's this wonderful woman called Lou Andrea Salome, who lived in the 1920s, and it was said of her, when she took on a lover, 9 months later, he gave birth to a book. And so he was. She had Mahler. She was Mahler's mistress. She was Nietzsche's mistress. She kind of had her way. And one thing that was said of her was that she was always faithful to her contradictions. And what I love about Mariana Alcofarado's letters is that in the course, when you read these letters, you will see her forgive him, admonish him, chastise herself. But she remains always faithful to herself, to her contradictions, and to what she believed to be true. And she never does it as a victim. She does it as someone who is coming from a position of force, and I think is a lesson to us all. So before I take some questions, I would just like to read a little bit from the letters, from the last letter, letter 5, which is one of my favorites. And she says, "I write to you for the last time, and I hope to have you know by the difference of terms and by the manner of this letter that you have at last persuaded me that you no longer love me, and so I must love you no more. Thus, I will send back by first dispatch all I still retain of yours. Do not fear I may write. I will not even write your name on top of the parcel. I have entrusted all these details to Donna Brites, who was wont to carry secrets far removed from these. I will be less suspicious of her troubles than of my own. She will take all necessary precautions to ensure that you receive the portrait and the bracelets you gave me. Yet, I want you to know that for some days now, I have felt the urge to burn and destroy these pieces, these tokens of your love once so dear to me. But I have in the past shown such weakness that you would never have believed me capable of such extremities." A little later, she will say, "I begged her never to speak of them, never to give them back, even though I may ask to see them once again, and to send them off at last without forewarning me. I came to know the extent of my love only now. I have tried my best to cure myself of it, and I fear I would not have dared attempt this had I foreseen such strife and such violence. I am convinced it would have cost me less pain to keep loving you, ingrate though you are, than to leave you forever. I have come to know that you meant less to me than my passion. Will I not learn that a loving heart, once affected, never forgets the one who quickened emotions unknown and unattainable till then, that all its impulses belong to its first love, that its first thoughts, its first wounds cannot be cured or blotted, that all these passions that offer help and that take pains to renew and content promise feelings the heart can no longer experience, that all the pleasures it seeks with no real wish to find them only should serve to show that nothing is more dear to it than the remembrance of its pain. Why have you taught me the imperfection and unpleasantness of a bond not meant to be eternal, and all the hardships that follow violent love when it is unrequited? Why must blind inclination and cruel destiny have us commonly pursue those who desire others? And one last little thing, because it's my favorite part of these letters. She says, I grant a nun does not normally inspire love, but were men capable of reason in their choices, they should attach themselves to nuns rather than to other women. Nothing prevents nuns from reflecting incessantly on their passion. They are not distracted by 1,000 things that dissipate and occupy the world. It must be very unpleasant to see the one we love always seduced by 1,000 trifles, and one must be greatly insensitive to suffer without distress that they speak forever of assemblies, clothing, promenades. One is forever exposed to new jealousies. Women are forever obliged to please, indulge, converse. Who can be sure that they dislike such duties, and that they service their husbands with extreme distaste and against their will? How they must distrust a lover who never questions, who easily believes, and who sees them with much trust and tranquility carry out these duties. But I do not seek pretenses to prove with logic that you should have loved me. These are mean devices, and I have employed much better without success. Thank you. Do you any... Are there any questions? Yes?
I have a question. Do you think that when Stendhal wrote his book on love, he was influenced by Portuguese nun?
Who is this?
Stendhal.
Oh, Stendhal. The question is, do you think that Stendhal's book, when he wrote on love, if he was influenced by these letters? And in fact, Stendhal says, it is necessary for us to love like the Portuguese nun, with that ardent soul whose fiery mark is left for us in her letters. Stendhal, Rilke, who was Rodin's secretary, Rilke translated the letters into German. I mean, these extraordinary, wonderful writers have championed the letters throughout the centuries. For example, Richardson's Clarissa was inspired by the Portuguese letters. The Dangerous Liaison, which we all know, which there's this wonderful play and the wonderful book by Laclos, the book was inspired by the Portuguese letters. And it is believed by scholars that the Sonnets to the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning was also influenced by the letters of a Portuguese nun. The letters would have a vital and crucial would create a vital and crucial turn in literature going forward, because it brought reality to writing and psychological truth, which had been experienced beforehand. Of course, at the time there were wonderful French writers like Racine and Corneille and Molière, and of course Shakespeare, is the great psychologist of us all. But language at that point, certainly French literature, was caught up in form, and she just cut to the quick. And she, in effect, created the beginnings of modern literature. Yes? I tripped over them in Montreal. They were being performed by a French actress. It's a nice thing to know that these letters, in fact, are so famous in Europe, and they read like a play. They're so extraordinary. And I highly recommend you read them out loud, because they do resonate in a wonderful way. They're often performed by French actresses, and they've been performed by French actresses through the centuries. Yes, you had a question.
You mentioned that in that last letter, she refers a lot to the fact that she felt the love was unrequited. Do you feel about that? Is that...
The question is, she refers a lot to the fact that the love was unrequited. And how do I feel? Was the love unrequited? And I think the facts speak for themselves, in fact. When he left for France, it would take 10 years for him to marry. And he would marry the woman reputed to be the most ugliest of France. It was a marriage of convenience. It was a contractual marriage. They would never have children. He is said to have gone into a religious conversion. So it's interesting to me, too. I mean, for me, it was very important that I not pass judgment on either of the characters or of the events, that I report the events as best I could. But it has always struck me as wonderful and extraordinary that this nun, and you must know that at the time, if a nun was found sleeping with a man would receive a $200 fine or choose to go in prison for a month or two. Whereas if a nun was found sleeping with a man, she had to go into 10 years of solitary confinement in a rat-infested dungeon at the bottom of at the convent. Mariana did not have that fate. She, in fact, would go on to run for abbess of the convent. And she would run twice, and the second time lose by only 10 votes. And so I've always found it a wonderful, I guess, a testimony to forgiveness within the religious faith, that they were able to be sympathetic to her and take her in, that the women of the convent took her in and forgave her. Which is something, we all strive to do. And certainly it was not a secret. And that too, it was not a secret. The reason why the officer left is it was about to become public knowledge. And it was at a time when, in the book I explain this, because it's like a big jigsaw puzzle I put together, and I think I should say that many, many books have been published on this subject throughout the years. What I do, I think, that hasn't quite been done before, is I've really placed the story in its proper historical context so that you can understand why the decisions that were made. But when he left, she had no way of knowing the reasons that were forcing him to leave. And he could not return to Portugal. We have to remember we're in the 17th century, so there was nowhere for them to go. I mean, if he did take her from the convent, they would have lived a life of squalor. If he did remain in Portugal, she would forever have remained a mistress, and eventually the affair would have come out. And for a French officer to be sleeping with the daughter of one of the richest noblemen of Portugal was not a good thing. And so he did the right thing in never getting in touch with her, in never having her know that he himself had been transformed, and never recovered from his love. So he did really the noble thing, as it were. Yes?
How difficult would it have been for her to find private time to write these letters and to receive gifts from him and things like that?
There was a rule in the convent that you had to eat at the refectory 150 times a year. But the rest of the time you could use as private time for yourself. And so a nun's day was a very full day. They worked from very early hours in the morning to very late at night, after midnight, in the having sung the matins. But they also, daughters of rich noblemen, were allotted their own private little houses on the convent grounds, which also explains how the affair could have taken place, and also explains, and they had servants, and they had people coming in and out of the convent for them constantly. So there would have been time for her to find time to write these letters. Yes?
In doing your research, did you work from the original language letters or from books of English translations, or did you translate them yourself, or all the above?
So he's saying when I was doing my research that I worked from the original letters. It is a part of the debate that exists till today is that there are no original letters. All we have is the published French letters. And so my translation is from French to English. Luckily for me, when I started translating them, because I became obsessed with them, I was with the Royal National Theatre at the time, and when you're at the Royal National, you're in repertory, so you play 4 nights a week, and then you have 3 days off. So I'd be with my dictionary, translating the letters, and it was, thank God for me, I didn't know that, of course, by then there were dozens of translations in existence, and that they in fact have been translated. The first translation of the letters were 10 years after the publication in 1679 in England by someone called Roger Lestrange, who has this, it's a fantastic translation because it's all in poetry, and it has very little to do with the letters, but it doesn't matter. And they took London by storm. I mean, the letters had an incredible life. They were translated into Russian, into German, into Italian. And it's interesting to note that the King of Portugal banned the letters from Portugal, and they were first translated into Portuguese 150 years later, after having been published in French. And when they were published in Portuguese, all the Portuguese scholars said, "Ha-ha! These are true, real letters," because in Portuguese she follows the exact rhythm of the Portuguese language. It's so easy for us to translate back into Portuguese. And of course they were right, but not necessarily that she had written them in Portuguese, but only that in writing in French, she had infused the writing with her Portuguese rhythms. And as is often the case, like when Joyce wrote in French, when Beckett writes in French, they enrich the language in which they write because they bring to it the knowledge, all of the knowledge of their own language. And so often a language gets richer and more vibrant due to the fact that someone is not writing necessarily in their mother tongue. Yes?
Given that these women in the convent, as you described them, became so gifted and so well prepared, that and they offered sort of solace and kind of perhaps intellectual companionship for the men, would there have naturally men and women being what we are, have developed quite a good many special perhaps non-sexual friendships between the men of the town and their given friend nun if they were visiting a lot.
So the question is, given the circumstances that I described, would there not have been many friendships between men and nun, and how would that play out, as it were? And it's interesting to note that century was known as the century of love for Portugal, and that the highest form of love, the highest considered form of love, was the Platonic love. And that was due to the fact of so many men and women entering in this very intimate relationship with them never having any kind of sexual overtone to them, and being very learned, relationships, indeed, where women had a wonderful place in men's lives and were able to influence major decisions that were being taken on many, many fronts. Oh, yes?
I'm puzzled the context of the publication and the privilege with this person. Were they published separately?
Oh, yes. Were the letters published separately? And I'll take 2 more questions after this. The letters were published absolutely separately from the Valentines, and so it was a very, very clever thing the publisher did, and he was known to be a very clever marketer. And I'm seeing people leaving, so I'll wrap up. But the letters were indeed published on their own. Yes?
Is there any evidence that these letters were translated into Spanish? And second part of the question, did they find their way to Mexico, specifically to the eyes of Solani and Asia?
Yes, the answer to those 2 questions is yes. I think I have to stop. But you know what? If you come and you can ask me the question while I sign a book. Thank you.